Welcome to After the War, Reconstruction Begins, Part 2, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. When the newly formed state governments in the South held elections in late 1865, fully half of the congressmen and senators they elected to represent them in Washington, D.C. were ex-Confederates. Several had been generals in the Confederate Army, having just waged war against the United States earlier that same year. Others had served in the Confederacy's Congress or Cabinet, and one, Alexander Stephens, had been the vice president of the Confederacy. Northern Republicans were astonished and disgusted at this turn of events. Most still considered former Confederates to be dangerous traitors. Many were dismayed by the Black Codes, which attempted to undo what the Civil War had accomplished, the end of slavery, and all refused to accept the new president's claim that Reconstruction had been accomplished by his policies. Congress in 1865 was heavily dominated by Republicans. Most Republicans were moderates. They wanted an end to slavery and treason, but weren't particularly concerned with black equality. Radical Republicans, a still smaller group within the party, were strongly dedicated to the rights of freed men and the transformation of Southern society. President Johnson succeeded in uniting both these groups against him. In December 1865, when Congress finally returned to Washington, its Republican majority simply refused to admit the new representatives from the South. The new governments that had elected them, Congress said, were illegitimate, and so were Johnson's policies. Congress announced its own plan for Reconstruction. Republicans were confident that they could pass their own laws over the president's vetoes if necessary. In 1866, Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, giving the agency extended powers to provide food and clothing to former slaves, establish schools, and supervise their labor contracts. Johnson vetoed the bill, stating that the government had no authority to provide a system for the support of indigent or poor persons. Congress tried but failed to override the veto. Congress next passed the Civil Rights Act. This law guaranteed African Americans to the same full and equal benefit of all laws for the security of person and property as is enjoyed by white citizens. By ending legal discrimination in state laws, the act was specifically designed to cancel out the Black Codes. Again, Johnson vetoed the law, finding it an invasion of states' rights. But this time, Congress had the votes to override the veto, 2/3 in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. It was the first time in American history that Congress had taken this dramatic step concerning major legislation. The President and Congress continued to clash when, in April 1866, Congress passed what would become the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It was then sent to the states to be ratified. The groundbreaking amendment was complicated and contained several provisions. One key part prohibited states from passing laws that took away the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States or denied them the equal protection of the laws. Another part of the amendment defined citizenship and said that anyone born in the United States was automatically an American citizen. This was intended to explicitly recognize African Americans as citizens. The notorious Dred Scott Supreme Court decision from a decade before had denied black citizenship. The 14th Amendment did not grant suffrage to freedmen, but it did allow Congress to punish states that denied black citizens the right to vote. These states could see their own representation in Washington reduced. Another section of the amendment forbid ex-Confederates from holding state or federal office unless Congress specifically allowed it. Although the president has no formal role in amending the Constitution, President Johnson advised Southern states to reject the 14th Amendment as an overreach of the federal government. All of them did so in 1866, except Tennessee, which became the first Confederate state to be officially welcomed back into the Union. Other Southern states would wait until 1868, the year the 14th Amendment officially became part of the Constitution, to ratify it. This amendment, which many Americans consider one of the most important parts of the entire Constitution, is one of the most powerful and lasting legacies of Reconstruction. Its guarantee of equal protection for all citizens remains an important foundation of American constitutional law down to the present. President Andrew Johnson and the Republican Congress were in an all-out war for power unlike anything seen before in American history. With most of the South still absent from Congress, Republicans continued to enjoy a veto-proof majority. And as Johnson and Southern Democrats became more defiant, the Republican Party, moderates, and radicals became more united. In 1867, Congress declared the ex-Confederacy, minus Tennessee, to be under military rule. Ignoring the state governments Johnson had authorized in 1865, the Military Reconstruction Act divided the 10 states into 5 military districts, as you see on the map here. A Union general was placed in charge of each district and was authorized to suppress insurrection, disorder, and violence at the barrel of a gun, if need be. The Union military was given the responsibility of registering voters, including freedmen, and setting up elections to create new state constitutional conventions. The constitutions each state came up with, which had to guarantee black suffrage, would then need to be approved by Congress for the state to be readmitted to the Union. The guarantee of black voting rights, something that wasn't even required of northern states at this time, represented the triumph of radical Republican policy. What had seemed radical only 2 years before was now the law in the South. Radical Republicans had convinced moderates in their party that only the voting power of freedmen could bring about lasting change in the South. There was another element to the plan as well. Black voters were almost certain to be loyal to the Republican Party, which would reap the benefits in future elections. President Johnson angrily vetoed the law. He believed that military rule of the 10 southern states was completely unconstitutional and would deny democracy to their citizens. Congress overrode his veto the very same day. Johnson fought back against Congress in every way his office permitted. He replaced the generals Republicans had picked to enforce Reconstruction with other generals he knew would resist it. And he fired officers from the Freedmen's Bureau and replaced them with others he knew would undermine its agenda. By this point, the president considered himself the proud defender of Southern whites against what he called Negro domination. By this, he meant voting rights for freedmen. In an annual address to Congress, Johnson attacked the very idea of black suffrage, which he considered a great evil. Negroes have shown less capacity for government than any other race of people. No independent government of any form has ever been successful in their hands. On the contrary, they have shown a constant tendency to relapse into barbarism. Many in Congress, and not just the radicals, now view Johnson as an enemy who must be removed from office if Reconstruction were to succeed. "Is the president crazy?" asked one moderate Republican. "I'm afraid his doings will make us all favor impeachment." The House of Representatives has the power to impeach a president, but only for what the Constitution calls treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That meant that as long as Andrew Johnson avoided breaking the law, impeaching him would be difficult, if not impossible. But Congress set a trap that the president was perfectly willing to spring. In 1867, Congress had passed a controversial law called the Tenure of Office Act. It forbid the firing of any government official, like a cabinet secretary, without the consent of the Senate, if that official had been originally confirmed by the Senate. In defiance of the law, Johnson removed Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, without the Senate's permission. Stanton was a Lincoln appointee who favored radical Reconstruction and often clashed with Johnson. The House of Representatives moved quickly. Every single Republican in the House voted for impeachment. Every single Democrat voted against it. The vote passed along strict party lines, 126 to 47. For the first time ever, an American president had been impeached. But this did not mean that Johnson was removed from office, yet. Impeachment is basically an indictment for high crimes and misdemeanors. Just like a criminal in court, an impeached president is entitled to a trial in the Senate, which then votes to remove him from office or not. Andrew Johnson's Senate trial lasted from March until May 1868. It was the hottest event in Washington. Tickets were even scalped. The president did not personally attend. His defense lawyers insisted on it. 7 House Republicans served as the prosecutors. Their leader, the heart and soul of the impeachment movement, was Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Radical, even for a radical, stubborn and uncompromising, Stevens had devoted his life first to anti-slavery and then, after emancipation, to racial equality for freed men. Stevens was ill and close to his own death when the impeachment trial began, but his rage at Andrew Johnson animated him. "Unfortunate man," he had cried out to Congress when urging impeachment, "surrounded, hampered, tangled in the meshes of his own wickedness. Unfortunate, unhappy man, behold your doom." At the trial, Stevens and the other prosecutors argued that President Johnson had broken the law when he violated the Tenure of Office Act. Everyone knew this reason was a technicality. Their real problem with Johnson was that they considered him a terrible president who was obstructing radical Reconstruction. Johnson's lawyers argued that the act was unconstitutional and that in any case it didn't apply to Edwin Stanton because he had been appointed by another president. In the end, 36 of 54 senators, 2/3 of the Senate, needed to vote guilty to remove Johnson. Only 35 did. 7 Senate Republicans joined all 12 Democrats and voted to acquit the president or find him not guilty. Andrew Johnson would survive to finish out the remaining 10 months of his presidency. Andrew Johnson kept a low profile during his last months as president. Having narrowly survived an embarrassing impeachment trial, the fight seemed to go out of him. Johnson sought but did not receive his Democratic Party's renomination for president. In 1868, the Democrats instead chose Horatio Seymour, who lost to Republican Ulysses S. Grant, the man who saved the Union, the greatest Union hero of the Civil War. Without Johnson's obstruction, radical Republican Reconstruction began in full force. By the summer of 1868, Congress agreed that 7 of 10 Southern states had met its conditions for readmission. The others would rejoin the Union in 1870. The Republican Party had never had a presence in the South before, but under congressional policies and military rule, Republican organizations were established in every Southern state. They attracted African Americans, white Southerners willing to embrace change, and Northerners who moved south to get in on the ground floor of the reinvented state governments. Many Southerners referred to the latter two groups as scalawags and carpetbaggers. The names weren't meant as a compliment. Although Southern blacks were guaranteed suffrage in their state's new constitutions, there was still no national law to this effect. Republicans in Congress remedied this by passing the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed all men the right to vote, regardless of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The amendment also gave Congress powers to enforce voting protections. Not a single Democrat in Congress voted for the 15th Amendment, but it was ratified by the states in 1870. Black citizens didn't just enjoy new voting power in the South, but they held political office as well. More than 600 African Americans, most of them former slaves, served as state legislators or judges. And for the first time ever in American history, North or South, black congressmen represented their states in Washington, D.C. 2 black senators and 14 black members of the House of Representatives were elected during the Reconstruction era. In some ways, Reconstruction was truly a revolutionary period of progressive change. But it would not last. Within a decade, due to a combination of Southern resistance and Northern indifference, Reconstruction would be largely abandoned. Black citizens of the South would enter a new period of restricted civil rights and Jim Crow segregation. Some historians call the late 19th and early 20th centuries the nadir or low point of race relations.